All right. So, hello, my name is Maitreyi Bharath, and this is my presentation on the differences between musical genres' effects on neurodivergence and cognition. All right, so let's learn why music and cognition is a good topic here. So, some of you might have heard of the Mozart theory, which was this idea of a few years back that Mozart's music was especially good for development, particularly for babies, and it improved brain development. So, actually, this theory is not really up to the hype. Many people assumed that Mozart's music helped with general brain development, but the theory was actually specific to a certain method of visualization and reasoning and had very temporary effects. However, this connection between Mozart and brain development led me to this question about whether classical music or a specific genre of music actually makes a difference in our cognitive abilities. So, here's some background on the topic. So, I actually conducted a previous study and a paper that I presented last year, and this research is a continuation of that project. So, in my previous study, I discovered that when participants listen to jazz instrumental music, it improves reading comprehension by increasing working memory efficiency. Working memory is our ability to temporarily store and process information simultaneously, such as memorizing a phone number and repeating the digits back in your head to remember it. And jazz instrumental music somehow increase the efficiency of that system and thereby improve reading comprehension. So now in this current research project, I wanted to investigate the effects on neurodivergence. My previous study was more about general cognition and musical genres, and I wanted to look at the educational impacts for neurodivergent students and neurodivergent people in general as well, and how music might impact productivity and learning in that regard. So background literature doesn't really connect music, neurodivergence, and reading ability or cognition all together, but music therapy has been shown as generally helpful for people with mental health conditions, including depression, ADHD, anxiety, OCD, autism, and other conditions falling under neurodivergence. And we've also seen that background music has been shown to improve reading comprehension performance for ADHD students in particular, while simultaneously impairing neurotypical students. Again, there's not much research in this regard, but there are a few findings. And finally, just to connect the whole working memory, reading comprehension, and neurodivergent aspect, lower working memory capacity connects to lower reading comprehension ability, which essentially means that the fewer items that you're able to hold and process simultaneously, the lower it is for your reading comprehension ability to deal with a lot of distractions in the background, such as music. All right. So that led me to this research question of how do different genres of music impact reading comprehension for neurodivergent people in particular, compared to neurotypical people as a building off of my previous project. And my hypothesis was in neurotypical participants, music will impair reading comprehension performance, while it'll improve reading comprehension performance for neurodivergent participants due to the previous research on music therapy and its benefits for neurodivergent conditions. All right, so before I get into the details, this research is pretty relevant to educational and productivity settings. It's particularly relevant to people that typically listen to music while working or studying, regardless of neurodivergence status. And it provides a lot more research on neurodivergence, music, and cognition as a whole, rather than just pairing neurodivergence and music or music and cognitive abilities separately. And this research's results might potentially improve learning attainment or productivity in tasks requiring extensive reading and analysis and benefit educational environments. All right, so let's get into the methods of how I conducted my experimental study. So I conducted a live study over Zoom with recruiting people to actually generate data from an original thing rather than a review paper. So I had 60 participants, both in high school and adults, and a couple middle school participants as well. And I separated participants into about 6 different genre groups. And all participants reported their age, gender, neurodivergent status, and other demographic factors themselves. So for the study, I had two stages. One was the reading comprehension task and the working memory task. So as stated previously, working memory and reading comprehension are related in that lower working memory capacity or ability to process information simultaneously and hold a lot of info is correlated with lower reading comprehension performance. So participants read two passages and answered reading comprehension questions, one passage with music in the background and one passage without. And the music that they listened to was dependent on the genre that they were assigned. We also investigated whether having music first versus silence first might have an impact when the participants were reading the two passages. And then participants also went through a working memory task without music in the background to get a baseline idea of their working memory capacity and how it might relate to their reading comprehension ability. So then through that experiment, we collected three sets of data. So we had the raw reading scores, which are the percentage of questions answered correctly on the reading comprehension task, the working memory scores, which was, again, the indicator of how much your working memory capacity held, and then adjusted scores, which was your raw reading score divided by your working memory score to normalize any differences in working memory capacity across participants. And for the analysis, I ran statistical tests. So whenever I had two group comparisons, perhaps music versus silence, having music first in the passage versus silence first, or comparing neurodivergent participants versus neurotypical participants in any stage of the study, I used t-tests. And then when I had multiple groups to compare, such as comparing all 6 genres against one another, I used one-way ANOVA statistical tests. All right, and now for the results. So my analysis is still ongoing. I'm looking into a lot of the in-depth implications of some of my results, but for the overall idea, some of the statistically significant results I got was that the rap genre group showed a significant difference in the effect of music on reading comprehension between those who had music in their first passage and silence in the second versus people who had a silent passage first and then listened to music in the background for the second passage. So the p-value, which is the probability of this being completely due to chance, was very low, below 0.05, indicating that it is a statistically significant difference. However, when I tried to analyze whether that was due to neurotypical versus neurodivergent differences, it appeared that the difference was not actually caused by the presence of neurodivergent conditions, which means that we must look to potential other factors such as familiarity with music, musical experience and training, and musical preferences. So this is an interesting finding because a lot of previous research shows that music impacts neurodivergent people differently and has impacts for musical therapy implications. So it's interesting to consider other factors that might also be compounded into an environment for neurodivergent participants and their learning environments. And then another result was that I investigated musical experience and its difference. And I found that people in the group with more musical experience perform better if I divided the groups in 10 years or more of experience versus less than 10 years, including having no musical experience at all. And as expected, people with more musical experience perform better on the reading comprehension task. This is kind of due to a lot of factors, one being that people with more musical experience could just be more used to having music in the background constantly and not as affected by the distraction, but also socioeconomic factors, in which case people with musical experience tend to have a lot more wealth and other resources available to them educationally as well, which could have factored into their scores. So one interesting finding was that the significance did disappear with further subdivisions, with separating out the no experience group and dividing other age groups by 5 years. So again, other factors. And similarly, neurodivergent and neurotypical analysis being separate did not seem to really be different based on the amount of musical experience. So overall, neurodivergence doesn't seem to be a driving factor of these findings, and it's important to consider other factors in educational environments that may cause differences for neurodivergent participants versus neurotypical participants when music is involved. And so, again, to just summarize, and some factors to consider in this whole thing is that although I had 60 participants, given the multiple genre divisions, sample sizes within genre groups were small. So it's important to consider that there might have been other factors that were not explicitly controlled for as independent variables in the study, such as familiarity with the music, musical preferences of each participant, their musical experience, and whether it was really whole numbers or maybe some in between, or how people might have interpreted musical experience outside of the definition provided during the study, and the idea of other factors to consider in creating productive learning environments for neurodivergent versus neurotypical people. I'd like to acknowledge my parents for making this study possible, my principal for helping me set up the IRB committee that allowed me to actually conduct my own experimental research and study with human participants, all the participants for agreeing to take part in the study, and my mentor in Polygence, this program, Liz. And here are my references. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know.
All right, thank you so much, Maitreyi. There was one question in the chat, and as a reminder, people can write questions in and we can answer them asynchronously, but I think you touched on this in the presentation, but the question was, I know you mentioned jazz, but what other genres have a positive impact? And then just the note, shocked to learn that Mozart theory isn't true.
Yeah, so in fact, that's a really great question. I think one thing that I should also clarify is that if I didn't mention a genre or like a finding that wasn't statistically significant, that means that there really wasn't any difference or impact that that genre had. So in the previous study, one interesting finding was that jazz instrumental music was actually the only genre that showed statistically significant impacts on reading comprehension ability. All the other genres I tested Western classical music, Indian classical music, rock, pop music, and none of those genres actually had a statistically significant impact. So really jazz was the main one. And there were a lot of like factors, including complexity, the harmonies, maybe possibly unfamiliarity with jazz music that could have caused that. And so I think that's what made it significant. None of the other genres really showed that in the data. And similarly here, it was very specific to rap having an effect, or I think one of the results I'm currently working on analyzing is rock music having an effect depending on working memory capacity. That's one I'm still working on in my analysis as I continue with this project. So again, it's like very specific genres depending on their statistical significance. And the Mozart theory part is actually very interesting. I myself didn't find out about it until like a couple years ago. But essentially, that paper is very specific to an idea of spatial temporal reasoning, which is like visualizing 3D objects in your head. And the paper made it very clear that it was a very temporary specific finding. But I think that with media influences, it kind of blew up. So that's one interesting thing to share. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you again so much. And if folks have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat.